All right, so when you're looking at macroeconomics, it's important to look at the economy as a whole. So when you're looking at supply and demand, we like to focus on aggregate supply and demand, which is the total amount of supply and demand in an economy. This is best modeled on a graph. So draw this out. On the y-axis, we put price level because supply and demand show the relationship, like how much you supply and how much you demand at certain price levels. Are at different prices. So on the y-axis, there's price level, and on the x-axis, there's real GDP, which is technically demand. So we can start with aggregate demand. It's a downward sloping line, and there's several reasons why aggregate demand is downward sloping. One of them is the real balance effect, which means that at higher price levels reduce the purchasing power of money. This decreases the quantity of expenditures. There's also the interest rate effect. When price levels increase, lenders need to charge higher interest rates to get real return. Higher interest rates discourage consumer spending. Former trade effect, which means when the U.S. price levels go up, foreign buyers purchase fewer goods, therefore, and the U.S. buys more foreign goods. Also, there's aggregate supply, which is directly related, or has a direct relationship, which means that it's going to be upward sloping. Aggregate demand is determined by four things. Pretty much, it's just what GDP is. So it's going to be your consumer spending, plus your investment, plus your government spending, plus your net exports. So aggregate supply is the amount of goods and services that firms will produce in an economy at different price levels. All right, so there are two types of aggregate supply. The first one that was drawn before is called the short-run aggregate supply, and the other one is called long-run aggregate supply, which is modeled by just a vertical line. The difference between these two curves is that in the short run, wages and resource prices will not increase as price levels increase, but in the long run, wages and resource prices will increase as price level increases. The long-run aggregate supply is just another model for a country's level of full employment or the natural rate of unemployment. This pretty much says that this is the efficient output that a country has. Like at this level, at this output, there is no cyclical unemployment. Therefore, the economy is in a state of equilibrium. For government actions, like if they tax businesses, then that also affects how much suppliers can supply. All right, so in an economy, often the aggregate supply and demand obviously change, and when that happens, there's two specific gaps that you can get in your graph by looking at your graph. One of them is called an inflationary gap, and an inflationary gap is defined as when a country's current equilibrium is higher than what their long-run aggregate supply is. So they're technically producing more than what they should be producing. So let's say if aggregate demand were to increase past the LRAS, you would get an equilibrium here, which is bigger than where you should be. And the other kind of gap is called a recessionary gap. And this is the exact opposite when you're producing less than what you're desired. So let's say aggregate demand were to decrease, then you would be producing less than what you should be producing at long-run aggregate supply. All right, so let's do an example. So if country is in a recessionary gap, and this axis represents price level, this axis represents real GDP, the masking tape line represents the LRAS, Atom over here represents short-run aggregate supply, and Cypher represents aggregate demand. So if country is in a recessionary gap, and they want to increase output back to equilibrium, they're going to have two options. They're going to either, one, increase government spending, which increases aggregate demand, or they can decrease taxes, increasing consumer spending. When this happens, the country will shift back to equilibrium. All right, so let's say country is in that same recessionary gap, and no government action is taken. At the current equilibrium that they're at right now, where prices are going to be deflated, therefore workers are going to be willing to work for less. Wages are going to fall, and suppliers are going to be able to supply more, shifting back to equilibrium.
Long and short run Phillips curve. So the Phillips curve is based on inflation and unemployment. And so the short run Phillips curve looks like this, and inflation and unemployment are inversely related. So from this point, there would be, say, 5% inflation and 2% unemployment. But here, there would be more unemployment and less inflation. And then, if the natural rate of unemployment was 4%, or let's say 6%, then the long run Phillips curve would be a straight line at 6% unemployment. Alright, so also the ASAD curves can shift, and that affects the Phillips curve. So, for example, if short run demand shifts to the right, then you have this point here, which creates an inflationary gap. So if short run increases from equilibrium to an inflationary gap, you get higher inflation and less unemployment. And then if demand were to shift to the left, the opposite would happen, and you would get more unemployment and less inflation. And then if short run supply were to shift to the left, that would actually give you less employment, but also less inflation. So the entire curve would shift to the left. And then if supply shifted in the other direction, you'd have more employment and more inflation, which is stagflation. Lastly, the only way to shift the long-run Phillips curve is to change the natural rate of unemployment with economic growth, which would cause the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift, which would cause the long-run Phillips curve to shift. So, the Phillips curve is a very important graph, and it tells us a lot about unemployment and inflation. It's probably my favorite. Now let's do an example. Imagine if you live in the country. If the natural rate of unemployment is 22% and GDP rises healthily, how will countries' unemployment and inflation be affected? Use the Phillips curve. First off, we know to mark our axes unemployment and inflation. Alright, so the natural rate of unemployment is 22%, so here we are. And this is going to be our starting point. And if GDP rises heavily, we know that on our ASAD graph, we know that aggregate demand will rise, which will cause an inflationary gap. So the unemployment will fall and inflation will rise. Phillips curve. It can help you find unemployment and inflation.
Okay, so the loanable funds market is the relationship between the quantity of loans and the real interest rate. The demand for loans is downward sloping, just like your aggregate demand curve, and the supply of loans is upward sloping. So some shifters of the demand are changes in perceived business opportunities, changes in government borrowing. That's because when the government needs to spend more money or spend less money, they're going to demand more loans, shifting the overall line. Now, changes in the supply of loan are affected by changes in private saving behavior, changes in public savings, changes in foreign investment, and changes in expected profitability. So when the supply and demand of loans change, it's going to affect the investment demand. That graph is quantity of investments and real interest rates. And all it is just a downward sloping demand curve of investments. So say you start at 3% real interest rate and the quantity of investments is 100. Now when demand increases, your real interest rates increase. So on this curve, when real interest rates increase to say 5%, the quantity of investments decreases. Okay, so if country's government decides to increase their budget deficit, how will the economy's aggregate demand be affected? So to do that, we go to the loanable funds market, and when the government increases their budget deficit spending, they're going to loan money, thereby increasing the demand of loans. So in this example, the equilibrium was at 6% real interest rate, but since they demanded more loans, the interest rate will increase. So then when you go to the investment demand graph, when you increase real interest rate, you move to a new point, and you can see that the quantity of investments decreases. Investments is a part that plays into aggregate demand, and when investment decreases, so does aggregate demand. So your new aggregate demand falls.
The money market. This graph is based off of the nominal interest rate and the quantity of money. So the demand line here is individuals' demand for liquid assets, and the things that affect that are price level, income, and changes in taxation that affect investment. And the supply line is straight up and down because it's a constant value set by the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve can shift the supply of money using these three things here. The first one, the reserve ratio, is the amount of money that banks are required to hold and not loan out to other people. The discount rate is the rate the Federal Reserve charges to other banks to borrow money from them. And then open market operations include the Federal Reserve like buying and selling bonds. So if the Federal Reserve wants to stimulate the economy and promote growth, they need to lower the nominal interest rate to promote business investment, and to do that, they need to increase the supply of money in the economy. They have three ways to do that. So they can lower the reserve ratio so that banks have more money on hand to loan out. They can lower the discount rate so that the banks can charge a lower interest rate to the people, and they can buy bonds on the open market, which would increase the supply of money in the economy.
We've got a problem. Our country's in a recession, and we need to raise the GDP. How can we, the Federal Reserve, do that? I think we should lower the required reserve ratio.
You know what? I think we should lower the discount rate.
Let's buy bonds.
No. Let's do my idea.
No, mine! Stop the fighting!
In our example, we have the recessionary gap. So that if we turn to the money market and we're trying to fix this with monetary policy, we can use any of the three options listed before. Any of these will shift the supply of money to the right and lower nominal interest rates, which in turn will increase business investment, which is a part of aggregate demand, which will shift aggregate demand to the right as well. Fixing the gap.
So we meet again.
Take yours.
It's hard to do this one. All right, I lost.